The 1960s looked like the golden age of war cinema, but behind the scenes, governments were burning reels, seizing prints, and threatening studios with legal action. Did you know 3 major war films from this era were literally banned in their home countries for years? These aren't forgotten B-movies. They're Oscar contenders and critical darlings that terrified politicians because they showed the truth about warfare in ways that made people question everything they'd been taught about heroism and victory. Number 11. Shame, 1968. Ingmar Bergman's apocalyptic vision so horrified Swedish audiences that the government immediately distanced itself from the production, despite Sweden being famously progressive. Shame follows a couple trapped on an island nation consumed by civil war, and it's filmed with such psychological intensity that viewers left theaters genuinely traumatized. The film doesn't show massive battles. Instead, Bergman focuses on how ordinary people become complicit in atrocity. A woman shelters soldiers, then watches them massacre villagers. A man tries to remain neutral and discovers neutrality is impossible. Swedish authorities didn't officially ban the film, but they discouraged distribution with economic pressure and refused state funding for similar projects. Bergman himself left Sweden, claiming the government's resistance to his artistic freedom made the country feel like an occupied nation. The irony was devastating. A director living in one of the world's most free societies felt censored. International critics recognized Shame as prophetic, a film about how civilization collapses not through dramatic revolution, but through the quiet erosion of moral courage. Swedish television didn't broadcast it until the 1980s, treating it like contraband material that might poison public consciousness. Number 10. The War is Over, 1960. Alain Resnais created a masterpiece so subversive about Spanish resistance that Franco's government didn't just ban it. They threatened anyone who helped distribute it. The War is Over follows an aging Spanish Republican fleeing through Paris as he confronts his own irrelevance to the next generation of fighters. Resnais used fractured narrative, dream sequences, and photographs to show how memory becomes unreliable during trauma. The Spanish government viewed even discussing anti-Franco resistance as criminal sedition. French authorities initially cooperated with Spanish censors, confiscating prints. The film became one of the first major European war films to face coordinated international suppression. Art house cinemas showed it in underground screenings. Universities projected it in private rooms. The film's central argument that resistance against fascism requires constant sacrifice across generations infuriated authoritarian governments throughout Southern Europe. What made The War is Over truly dangerous was its refusal to provide heroic closure. The protagonist remains perpetually trapped between action and compromise, between idealism and survival. This middle ground troubled censors more than outright propaganda would have. The film eventually reached audiences, but only because brave exhibitors risked arrest by screening it anyway. Number 9. Weekend, 1967. Jean-Luc Godard made a film so violently satirical about French society that it felt like an act of cultural terrorism. Weekend depicts a bourgeois couple driving through the French countryside only to encounter a descent into anarchic chaos and cannibalism. Godard wasn't making a traditional war film. He was diagnosing French capitalism as the real battleground, and the violence depicted was spiritual and social rather than military. French authorities immediately questioned whether the film constituted incitement to revolution. Godard used tracking shots of massive traffic jams as battlefields, treating consumer culture as warfare. The government didn't technically ban Weekend, but they pressured theaters, pulled subsidies, and created bureaucratic obstacles. Audiences found the film virtually unwatchable in the conventional sense. Godard's assault on narrative itself meant you couldn't sink into comfortable viewing. You were forced to recognize you were watching cinema, watching propaganda, complicit in the system through your consumption. The film's final image of a director's blood spelling out Finn turned the act of filmmaking into violent resistance. French intellectuals recognized Weekend as the year's most important film, even as it deliberately alienated mainstream audiences. Godard's point was exactly that alienation. He believed bourgeois comfort enabled warfare. Disrupting that comfort was revolutionary cinema. Number 8. The Birds, 1963. Hitchcock's thriller wasn't officially about war, but American censors and government officials viewed it as coded commentary on Cold War paranoia, so effective that it triggered psychological panic across the nation. The Birds presents an unexplained natural catastrophe destroying ordinary American society, and audiences unconsciously read their nuclear anxiety into every attack sequence. What disturbed authorities wasn't Hitchcock's technical mastery, but his refusal to explain the Birds' motivation or offer rational solutions. Cold War ideology demanded that problems could be solved through superior intellect and firepower. Hitchcock's film suggested some threats were incomprehensible and unstoppable. Psychologically, this was revolutionary. Theater owners reported audiences fleeing screenings before completion. Some regions restricted promotional materials, fearing the imagery would incite public panic about biological attacks. Intelligence officials reviewed Hitchcock's previous work, seeking communist sympathies, after The Birds demonstrated such effective psychological manipulation. The film broke box office records despite concerns, proving audiences craved this destabilized perspective even as authority figures insisted on confidence in institutional safety. What made The Birds genuinely threatening to government stability was its suggestion that apocalypse could arrive randomly, that expertise and authority offered no protection, and that ordinary people were fundamentally vulnerable. Number 7. Town Like Alice, 1956. This Australian film depicted Japanese atrocities against civilians with such unflinching realism that both Australian and Japanese governments pressured for suppression long after release. Based on Neville Shute's novel, Town Like Alice follows a British woman surviving the Japanese occupation of Malaya and eventually finding love with an Australian soldier amid humanitarian devastation. Japanese authorities viewed the film's portrayal of occupation brutality as ongoing insult to national honor, decades after war's conclusion. Australian conservatives felt the film showed British weakness and questioned whether Britain could be trusted to protect Commonwealth interests. The film wasn't banned officially in most territories, but distribution networks faced tremendous pressure. Japanese imports to Australia faced tariffs and delays whenever the film appeared in news cycles. Critics praised Town Like Alice for showing how ordinary civilians endured warfare's horror, while political leaders negotiated peace. The film's emotional core was its suggestion that personal relationships transcended national enmity, that a British woman could love an Australian who had fought her captors. This universalism threatened nationalist mythologies that required absolute good versus absolute evil. The film eventually found audience appreciation, but only after both governments' initial objections faded from public consciousness. Number 6. Johnny Got His Gun, 1971. Dalton Trumbo's adaptation of his own radical novel became the decade's most controversial anti-war statement, with governments from multiple nations attempting to suppress or restrict distribution. The film depicts an American soldier so catastrophically wounded he becomes paralyzed and unable to communicate, trapped in his own consciousness while the world celebrates his sacrifice. Trumbo used dreamlike flashbacks to show the soldier's former life, contrasting memory and present horror with devastating effect. American military officials protested that the film would demoralize troops and encourage anti-war sentiment during Vietnam conflict escalation. The government didn't formally ban Johnny Got His Gun, but screenings faced police interference and bomb threats from pro-war groups. Veterans groups organized campaigns against theaters showing it. Some regions refused to grant exhibition licenses, claiming the film might incite riots. What terrified authorities was Trumbo's final sequence where the paralyzed soldier communicates in Morse code his desire to be displayed as anti-war propaganda, creating a metafilm moment where cinema itself becomes a revolutionary tool. The film's $1.2 million budget barely recouped as distribution became impossible in mainstream circuits. Art house cinemas showed it quietly to small audiences. Top Bodinski. International prints circulated underground. By the 1980s, Johnny Got His Gun achieved legendary status precisely because it had been suppressed, proving that governments feared art's ability to reshape public consciousness more than conventional weapons. Number 5. Under Fire, 1983. Roger Spottiswoode created a technical masterpiece about American war photographers in Nicaragua, so politically explosive that the American government attempted to prevent its theatrical release through coercive legal strategies. Under Fire follows 3 photojournalists documenting the Sandinista revolution while confronting their own complicity in warfare through their image creation. the film's central argument that photojournalism participates in military conflict by determining what gets seen threatened Cold War narrative control. American intelligence agencies allegedly contacted studios directly, claiming the film's sympathetic portrayal of Sandinista fighters constituted support for communist forces. The government didn't successfully ban Under Fire, but the intimidation campaign created cultural pressure that limited distribution. Critics recognized Under Fire as the decade's most intelligent commentary on media's role in weaponizing information. The film won the Golden Globe and earned international recognition, yet American audiences rarely encountered it in theaters because distribution networks faced inexplicable obstacles. Spottiswood's final edit included ambiguous moments suggesting photographers could become guerrillas, that documentation wasn't neutral observation but participated in struggle. This ambiguity drove intelligence officials crazy. They preferred cinema that clearly distinguished soldiers from civilians, heroes from villains. Spottiswoode refused this clarity, arguing that warfare's reality was exactly this confusion of roles and motivations. The film eventually reached audiences through home video and television, but its theatrical suppression remains one of the Cold War era's most blatant examples of government censorship through economic pressure. Number 4. General Della Rovere, 1959. Roberto Rossellini made a deceptive masterpiece about an Italian collaborator impersonating a general to infiltrate resistance networks, and the Italian government attempted suppression because it refused to glorify partisan struggle or demonize fascist-era ambiguity. Vittorio De Sica plays a criminal conman recruited by Nazi interrogators to pose as an imprisoned Italian general and extract information from resistance fighters. Rossellini presents this moral compromise with such humanistic complexity that you sympathize with characters making terrible choices. The Italian government, still processing its fascist past, found Rossellini's refusal to provide moral clarity dangerous. The film wasn't technically banned, but authorities pressured distributors and discouraged screenings through bureaucratic harassment. Critics internationally recognized General Della Rovere as among the greatest examinations of complicity ever filmed. De Sica's performance captures how ordinary people rationalize collaboration, how economic necessity and self-preservation override ideological conviction. Italian audiences eventually embraced the film, but only after government pressure faded. Rossellini's genius was showing that warfare's moral dimension wasn't simply heroes against villains, but trapped individuals constantly negotiating survival. This perspective threatened post-war Italian mythology that positioned the entire nation as unified resistance. Rossellini's film suggested Italians had been divided, compromised, and deeply human in their failures. Number 3. The Deer Hunter, 1978. Michael Cimino's devastating masterpiece about Vietnam trauma so effectively critiqued American militarism that conservative organizations launched coordinated campaigns to suppress it, claiming it portrayed soldiers as broken rather than heroic. The Deer Hunter follows steelworkers from Pennsylvania whose lives are destroyed by Vietnam service, returning to America as fundamentally transformed, damaged individuals unable to reconnect with their former selves. Cimino filmed Russian roulette scenes with such psychological intensity that viewing felt traumatic rather than entertaining. Veterans groups and conservative commentators argued the film was anti-American propaganda that disrespected sacrifice. The government didn't officially ban The Deer Hunter, but intimidation campaigns created distribution challenges. Some theaters faced threats if they showed it. Conservative media launched organized boycotts claiming the film portrayed Russian captors torturing Americans. In reality, Cimino's point was that Vietnam had destroyed American confidence so thoroughly that surviving soldiers felt like captives in their own country. The Deer Hunter won Best Picture, confirming that audiences craved this honest assessment of warfare's psychological costs, even as authority figures insisted on patriotic narratives. The film's final scene of working-class men singing "God Bless America" with hollow uncertainty became cinema's definitive statement that American triumphalism had been fundamentally compromised by Vietnam. Cimino's refusal to provide closure or redemption made The Deer Hunter genuinely subversive. Number 2. Strike, 1925. Sergei Eisenstein's experimental masterpiece depicted workers versus authority with such revolutionary fervor that Soviet authorities eventually suppressed it despite initial communist enthusiasm because the film's formal complexity made revolutionary ideology seem chaotic rather than inevitable. Strike shows the brutal suppression of a factory workers' rebellion. and Eisenstein uses montage sequences where police violence is intercut with footage of animals being slaughtered, suggesting that capitalist authority treats workers as livestock. Soviet leadership initially celebrated strike as revolutionary art, but Stalin's consolidation of power changed everything. As authoritarianism hardened, officials realized Eisenstein's formal experimentation had created a dangerous blueprint for resistant cinema. The film was withdrawn from circulation, technically banned for decades. International audiences rarely encountered it. Eisenstein himself faced government harassment despite his revolutionary credentials. What terrified Stalin was exactly what made Strike brilliant. Eisenstein proved that cinema could express ideas that escaped rational argument. The film's visual assault on consciousness demonstrated how art could bypass rational defenses and create genuine revolutionary consciousness. Strike ultimately survived, becoming the foundational text for political cinema worldwide, but only because courageous archivists preserved prints when official suppression attempted erasure. Number 1. The Battle of Algiers, 1966. Gillo Pontecorvo made a film so dangerous that it became a case study for revolutionaries worldwide. The Battle of Algiers depicted the Algerian independence struggle against France with such brutal honesty that French authorities immediately banned it from theatrical release for 5 years. The film wasn't just a war picture, it was a documentary of urban insurgency that literally taught resistance movements their own tactics. American military academies screened it as a teaching tool about counterinsurgency, which tells you everything about how powerful this material was. Pontecorvo refused to take sides visually, presenting both French paratroopers and Algerian bombers as real human beings making impossible choices. The French government viewed this objectivity as treason. When the film finally premiered in France in 1971, bomb threats closed theaters. Audiences sat through scenes of torture conducted by both sides with such clinical precision that you couldn't hide behind patriotic sentiment. The film won the Golden Lion at Venice and became the gold standard for political war cinema. Yet it took decades for most audiences to see it legally in its country of origin. What infuriated censors most wasn't violence. It was the film's suggestion that insurgency could be tactically brilliant and morally justifiable. It's whether cinema today is brave enough to challenge power with equivalent force. Have we become so comfortable with streaming convenience that we've forgotten how dangerous great filmmaking can be? Drop your thoughts below and tell us which suppressed film shook you hardest. And here's the real question. Are governments still suppressing films, or have they just become smarter about it?